Okay, good. Okay, there you are. Thanks, Carol, for doing this and for being so flexible since we had technical difficulties the last time a few weeks ago when we tried to hook you up with this talk. I know it was originally supposed to be one of the adult learning forum topics, but we appreciate that you are sharing it with everybody. Let's start with a musical piece. This is a song called Rise Up for Heroes, performed by Kennedy Holmes. Kennedy Holmes is a St. Louis native who was a contestant on The Voice in a prior season. Hit it. Where do I see Sarah? There she is.
I close my eyes and I can see a world that's waiting up for me, that I call my own. Through the dark, through the door, through where no one's been before, but it feels like home. They can say it all sounds crazy. They can say I've lost my mind. I don't care if they call me crazy. We can live in a world that we design. 'Cause every night I lie in bed, the brightest colors fill my head. A million dreams are keeping me awake. I think of what the world could be, a vision of the one I see. A million dreams is all it's gonna take. Oh, a million dreams for the world we're gonna make. There's a house we can build. Every room inside is filled with things from far away. Special things I compile, each one there to make you smile on a rainy day. They can say it all sounds crazy. They can say we've lost our minds. Oh, see, I don't care if they call us crazy. Take me to a world that we design. 'Cause every night I lie in bed, the brightest colors fill my head. A million dreams are keeping me awake. I think of what the world could be, a vision of the one I see. A million dreams is all it's gonna take. Oh, a million dreams
Thank you. That was an inspiring song that we need right now, I think. And so without further ado, Carol, I think you need to unmute yourself, and then we can look forward to hearing your presentation.
Okay, well, this presentation is concerning the legalization of marijuana. And that's not something specifically I studied as a professor, but I have my PhD in criminal justice. And one of the things that people in the field do will try to evaluate what the effects of different laws and programs and so forth. When we pass laws or we have programs, we kind of assume that they will do specific things. But of course, sometimes that turns out not to be the case. Sometimes you have side effects that you really weren't anticipating. And the idea of doing the research is to find out actually what does go on when, say, you do something like legalize a new drug. So now let's see, from beginning. First I got a slideshow from beginning. There we go. Okay, so if you look at the history, until the 1930s, marijuana was, in many states it wasn't regulated at all, but in some, the specific states might have regulations concerning it, but it was all over the place. But in the 1930s, this Marijuana Tax Act was passed, and that was the first act at the federal level. However, in 1970, the Controlled Substances Act was passed. And what this act does, if you're not familiar with it, maybe you are, is it classifies drugs into one of 5 categories that they call schedules. So there's Schedule 1 drugs, Schedule 2 drugs, 3, 4, and 5. Schedule 1 drugs are forbidden altogether. Nobody's supposed to have them. For example, heroin. Marijuana is another one. Schedule 2 through 5 have various degrees of regulation. And you're kind of familiar with this. You know, sometimes you get a medicine and it will say no refills. Okay? And other times you get a medicine, you get some sort of medicine and so you can have as many refills as you want. You know, so those are varying degrees of regulation and control. Obviously, Schedule 2 drugs include the opioids. And I think one of the reasons that the opioid crisis kind of snuck up on us was because these drugs were supposed to be tightly controlled, and that really wasn't supposed to happen, that they should become a problem. Now, if you look at Schedule 1 drugs, they're totally forbidden, and the rationale that they used in classifying drugs as Schedule 1 was that, first of all, if they had a high potential for addiction, and if they had no known medical usage. Now, people started criticizing this from the very beginning. One of the things they pointed out was that alcohol and tobacco don't appear in this act at all. But of course, both do have a high potential for addiction, and they certainly don't have any medical usage. Although actually they are useful if you get a bee sting, if you slap some rubbing alcohol on or tobacco, that will give you some relief. But for all practical purposes, no medical usage. So in this act, marijuana was classified as a Schedule 1 drug, totally forbidden. And very early on, there was this commission, the Schaefer Commission, and they recommended changing this because they said we should really study marijuana, and we don't really know very much about it. Well, at that time, Nixon was president, and he had a habit actually of appointing commissions and then rejecting their findings. So needless to say, he rejected this, and marijuana continued to be a Schedule 1 drugs. But then what happened was over the next decades, there were reports that sounded pretty good that marijuana provided relief for a variety of symptoms. But because it was a Schedule 1 drug, there wasn't any controlled research going on. And that's been a criticism all the way along the line with everything that's going on, is that, you know, when we look at other drugs, when they're used on people, presumably we've done all these studies with experimental and control groups and looked at dosage and all those kinds of things. And what we have for marijuana is very, very limited because nobody was supposed to be doing research on it because nobody was supposed to have it. And so, you know, we're kind of starting in a place where we don't have a lot of information. But despite that, people used it anyway, and they found that there seemed to be, as I said, these credible reports that there were positive medical effects. And of course, this is in contradiction to what the idea was of having a Schedule I drug. A Schedule I drug is one that has no known medical usage. And people are coming back and saying, well, actually, it does seem that they have some medical usages, and maybe we should be looking at this particular drug. So what happened is that California passed the first act that allowed for medical marijuana, and then a bunch of states followed very quickly. The last time I checked, only 4 states don't have any legislation concerning marijuana. That may have changed by now. It seems it's been changing very rapidly. So anyway, and as I said, I already said this, that their Schedule I drugs supposedly don't have any medical benefits, yet it seems like marijuana does. So if we look at it, actually the Controlled Substances Act is still in effect at the federal level. So in a way, all these state acts have been passed, which include medical marijuana, and then in some states legalization. They're really in violation of federal law, which is kind of a peculiar state of being. We don't normally have that kind of situation. Usually state law and federal law line up. And in fact, originally when the Controlled Substances Act was passed, a lot of states adapted that into their state laws. They just did a cut and paste. They don't have to do that, but they did. But now that they've started passing all this legislation concerning marijuana, actually, technically speaking, it's in violation of federal law. Now, the laws that have been passed in the different states are quite different from one another. Some are very narrow, like one specific disorder, maybe you can get medical marijuana, and others are very broad. Then in addition, we have a number of states that have legalized marijuana. And so you can see there's a pretty strong trend. One would suspect that ultimately many states will end up legalizing marijuana. But as it stands now, they're in violation of federal law. Now, what Congress has done at several points, the last one was last November, is that they've proposed taking marijuana out of Schedule I in the Controlled Substances Act. And in fact, the House passed that back in November. But it's kind of in limbo because the Senate hasn't done anything. You know how it goes, is that since we have a Democratic Congress, but we have a Republican Senate, the House will pass something, the Senate will say, oh, I don't know about that. So it's kind of, unless it's passed like in the last few days, and I haven't caught it, it's just kind of in limbo. And of course, now both Congress and the Senate are rather concerned about other issues at the moment, so that's not, a high priority. So anyway, a lot of researchers have urged the removal of marijuana from Schedule I because they want to do controlled research, just like we do with other drugs. Now, at this time, even though technically at the federal level, it's against the law to have marijuana, and the states now, some of them have legalized it, the federal government hasn't actively intervened. The Supreme Court has said that they could, but they just left it vague. And as I said, the House introduced legislation to remove it from Schedule I. Now, one of the things that was done under the Obama administration was the Department of Justice passed something that says that they can't use funds to prevent states from passing laws legalizing marijuana, and that they would renew this annually. So it's kind of, again, it's just kind of out there. Under the Obama administration, the philosophy was let the states experiment. And actually in criminal justice, we allow for that a lot. A state might try out something and the other states will be watching to see how it goes. And so they refer to that as the living laboratory, is let one state be a laboratory, let others watch, and then other states, if they want to do the same thing or some variations, they do it, and then you compare the results and so on and so forth. There was some pushback initially by the Trump administration. Sessions announced that the federal government would enforce federal marijuana law. Right after that, the Vermont legislature voted to legalize marijuana. So, I mean, obviously, they didn't take them too seriously. Now, one of the things that was said is that the federal government could withhold federal funds from states if they passed such marijuana legislation. And there's some precedent for that. Periodically, the government has said, you know, well, if you do this, we won't give you any federal funds. Actually, if you look at when the FBI compiles crime statistics, all the individual police departments have to cooperate and send in their statistics. And because they don't have to answer to the FBI, they could refuse, but they don't. Mostly because it's professional courtesy. That's how they view it. But it is the case that if you, if a particular jurisdiction didn't turn in their statistics, they couldn't get grant money. Yeah, that would be an automatic. They would toss your grant out of the pile. So, you know, theoretically you could do that, but that hardly ever arises because all the police departments, for the most part, do provide their statistics. So they could, but they don't. I believe they did that with sanctuary cities. I think the government said, you know, if you continue to take this line of reasoning, we'll withhold federal funds from you. They could, whether they would, you know, is another issue. So that's where it stands right now. Clearly, it's become the case that medical marijuana and following behind it, the legalization of marijuana is happening. And what does that mean? Well, obviously, drugs have some effects. You know, you can have short-term effects, which I've listed here: paranoia, altered sense of time, mood changes, loss of coordination, memory loss. I always talk about that, and so forth. Now, long-term effects, there isn't a whole lot of systematic research on this because, again, it's a Schedule I drug, and so nobody's supposed to have it. It wasn't legal, and so how can you do long-term effects for people who are using it for 10, 20, 30 years, et cetera. But anyway, you can see some of the things that I've listed are, you know, cognitive impairment, memory loss, et cetera. People talk about apathy, people becoming sort of amotivational, I think is the term is used, lung-related problems, et cetera. So, you know, it would be a good idea to have a better handle on long-term effects. That's what they think is going on. Now, there are lots of debates. One of the things that people have always argued for not allowing marijuana to be legal was they argued that it was a gateway drug. It's commonly used. And the reason they say this is that, well, people who use what we might call serious drugs used marijuana first, okay? And then they go on to use other drugs. Now, the flip side of that, as I've indicated here, is that lots of people who use marijuana don't go on to use other kinds of serious drugs. Or if they do, it's just, you know, just an experiment and they don't do it anymore. So, you know, for it being, you know, it's not like the floodgates are released when you use marijuana. Most people don't go on to use, say, heroin and cocaine and that kind of thing, or at least not extensively. Now, some people also pointed out that, well, if marijuana is a gateway drug, certainly alcohol is, because almost all hard drug users used alcohol first. And another thing that they found was, they found this early on back in the 70s with heroin users, is that they could get them into programs and some people would give up heroin, but then they found to their distress that a fair number of them became alcoholics. So I suppose they're somewhat better off because at least they're addicted to a drug that's legal. But of course, being an alcoholic is still problematic. And they started changing treatment programs then to try to incorporate the idea that, well, you know, you're addicted to one drug, you get another, alcohol being one of them. But anyway, you know, if it's the case that it's a gateway drug, they make the argument that alcohol might be the ultimate gateway drug, and so maybe we should not have alcohol if that's the case. Okay, so at any rate, there's debate about that gateway concept. Now, some people, and I've heard this especially from people who are kind of conservative, is they said that marijuana leads to mental illness such as schizophrenia. And I'm not sure exactly where that's coming from because that's a genetic based disorder. And there really isn't any evidence that marijuana use would cause schizophrenia. In fact, most people who use marijuana certainly don't become schizophrenic. And maybe it's because, as I put here, that there are mental health personnel that have thought that marijuana use makes the symptoms of mental illness worse. And what will happen is they'll say you've got people and they know something's wrong with them. You know, they've got some insight, and they kind of try to self-medicate with different kinds of drugs, and one of them being marijuana. And what clinicians have said is they think that makes it worse. You know, that they're trying to make themselves better, but actually that people become more out of it if they use marijuana. But you could see how people would look at this and say, well, look, you've got people who are schizophrenic who are using marijuana. Maybe the marijuana causes schizophrenia. Although actually it's more likely to be the reverse, is that they become mentally ill and they try out different drugs in order to see if they can make themselves better, because typically people don't particularly like the major tranquilizers and other drugs that you get when you're on schizophrenia. They have side effects that are more unpleasant as opposed to marijuana, which doesn't give you such unpleasant side effects. So that may be the reason why. Now, other things that have been raised, have there been impacts on society as a result of states legalizing? There have been some studies already, but they're still pretty recent. You know, we really need like about 10 years of data before we can really make a lot of statements with confidence, and we can't do this. One of the things you have to watch is that when you look at marijuana and then you say, does it have an effect, is you're looking at what's called correlational research. If we see a before and after effect, that doesn't mean it's cause and effect. Now, for instance, let's look at something like the first time I ever heard anything about marijuana having negative effects is they said there are more traffic accidents. Well, and which actually that doesn't seem to be the case, but I heard that initially. Well, lots of things cause traffic accidents, right? Well, for instance, if you have a bad winter, the number of accidents may go up. So what if you introduce marijuana, you had a bad winter, and accidents go up? Are accidents going up because of the weather, or are they going up because people are using marijuana? Well, you can't untangle them at that point. You're going to have to do some other studies in order to establish that. So you have to watch that. Sometimes it will look like one thing happens and another thing happens. That doesn't mean the first thing caused the second thing. Okay? You're going to have to, usually you're going to have to do more research before you can say that. And another thing is that they talked about marijuana and crime rates. Well, crime rates are affected by multiple variables. Lots of factors affect crime rates. And I won't even go into that, spend 15 minutes talking about that. But because of that, we have to be really careful about what we say. So we might think that marijuana might affect crime rates or whatever, but maybe other variables will account for changes. So when I run through this a little bit, you'll notice I'm saying, well, we really don't know. We really don't know, because we have to be really careful. Okay. Now, what things have been observed? Well, one thing that seems to be pretty clear is that even when you just add in medical marijuana, okay, recreational marijuana use seems to increase. Okay, at least if we can believe people's self-reports. So, it seems like it kind of opens the door, so to speak, even though it's supposed to just be for medical purposes, people start using it more widely generally. And that seems to be fairly well established. Okay, so that's something, it's not like, we'll just have in our state, we'll just have medical marijuana, it won't affect everybody else. Yeah, it does seem to. Okay, and I guess it's psychological. Once it's out there, people will use it more. Now, another thing, they've looked at states that have like for instance, legalized marijuana versus those that haven't. And they have found actually some decrease in crime. Now, you have to be careful with this because crime overall has fallen in the United States over the last 25 years. Okay, there's just been a steady decline, not a huge decline, but it keeps dropping year after year. Sometimes you have blips up and down, but that's been the trend. And That's been the trend actually in other countries too. If you look at other first world countries, their crime rates are lower, but they experienced the same rises that we saw through the 70s and 80s, and then in the 90s, and then their rates also started to decline. And as I said, their rates are lower to begin with, but it was the same trend. So clearly something's going on, and probably it doesn't have anything to do with marijuana. However, they compared states that had it and states that don't, and they said, well, crime rates seem to have fallen a bit more in states that pass marijuana laws versus those that don't. One of the places they've seen this is there have been decreases in homicide and assault rates. Now, that's led people to speculate, and this is just a hypothesis at this point, is that if people substitute marijuana for alcohol, you probably would expect, if it were widespread, certainly, you would expect that homicide and assaults would fall. Or, remember, marijuana makes you kind of mellow out. And we know that alcohol, for some people, it tends to make them more aggressive. Okay? In fact, really, if you look at drugs in the United States, alcohol's a big problem. Okay? If you look at what police officers have to deal with and so forth, it's drinking. You talk to prisoners and you ask them what happened, how'd you end up here? Well, you wouldn't be too surprised if the first words out of their mouth was, I got drunk and then they tell you their story. Okay, that's just the reality of it. And so it may be that marijuana might actually result in less violent crime because people who are under the influence of marijuana typically don't engage in as much violent crime. Now, again, there are a lot of myths about this. Back in the 1930s, there was this movie that came out called Reefer Madness. I don't know, you may have heard of it. And people kind of laugh about it because in the movie, people smoke marijuana and it's like Night of the Living Dead. Their eyes light up and they go and they become violent. I think there's a murder in it and the boy's life is ruined and it's because he smoked marijuana. But that's not really very typical, shall we say. But a lot of people have been led to believe that, but it doesn't seem to be the case. As I said, alcohol, people, and we all know that, people get drunk and some people get violent. So anyway, excuse me, I need some water. Okay. Other things that have happened, one of the things that they've looked at is they were afraid when they had marijuana dispensaries that we'd see an increase in property crime. And that really hasn't happened either. Okay, there have been some studies that looked at that, and it seems like that people had the idea that these dispensaries would be a logical target for crime. So typically what we find is that the security surrounding them is really good, okay? And that makes it less likely that that will be the case. So we really haven't seen that. Traffic accidents, like actually, if you smoke marijuana, they estimate, and the studies I said are kind of recent, but that it makes about twice as likely that you'll be involved in a traffic accident. And we know this with other drugs too. How many drugs do you have that say on the label, do not drive or operate heavy machinery while you're using this drug? Okay, that's very common. So at any rate, we do find that it's more likely that you'll be in a traffic accident. Now again, we compare this to alcohol, which has a much greater likelihood of your being involved in a traffic accident. And again, alcohol's been our big problem, frankly. Now, why would that be? Well, with marijuana, what they find is that drivers tend to drive really slowly, which of course can get you in an accident. But what we find with people who use alcohol is they tend to drive faster and to take more risk. And that makes it much more likely that you'll have an accident. And so when they've compared states that have, as the states have legalized, they've compared states that don't have it with states that have it. And they're not really seeing much impact on traffic accidents one way or another. Although I have heard that again, but when I looked at the research literature, legitimate studies, not what some person is popping off and saying, it just doesn't seem to have much effect. Okay, another thing they found is that suicide rates have dropped some. Okay, and then, as I said, in one state, rates dropped 10%. Now, again, is this because of marijuana or is it because of some other reason? Maybe something else is going on. Suicide rates, again, are affected by a wide variety of factors. Okay? And what people have said is that, well, we should keep looking at this. Okay? And again, as we accumulate information, as we look at different states and make comparisons and so forth, if something else is going on, we try to figure out what that was. Obviously, if suicide rates drops, that's something we want to encourage. Okay? So whatever has caused them to drop a little bit, we would want to see more of that. Whether it's marijuana, hard to say at this point. Okay? They found that states that have legalized, there seems to have been some impact, but it's really too soon to be able to say that. Okay. They've also found, interestingly enough, that there are lower rates of opioid deaths in states with wider use of marijuana. Okay. And so again, it may be substitution. You know, if you're in pain, for instance, I guess marijuana will take away pain. You know, so you know, you might see more people turning to that as opposed, you know, especially as the word gets out that opioids will kill you. But again, it's uncertain at this point. Okay, this is just initial findings. But they say, obviously, again, this is something that we should be doing more research on. And again, we'll have a better idea in some years. Law enforcement. Many police officers would like to see marijuana legalized. Okay, they feel like there are other things that need to occupy their time that are more pressing. One of the problems right now is that because of changes in laws, there are wide disparities in the enforcement of laws. Like, so for instance, if you look at a state like Mississippi, now we have medical marijuana, but recreational marijuana is illegal. Now, by disparities, I mean that sometimes what police officers will do is they'll just overlook it. Okay? I was told, this is anecdotal, that in St. Louis, that a lot of times police officers will just say, no, you can't have that. Take it away from you and send you on your way. And so, but in some other instance, you might get zapped. I believe it's still a Class A misdemeanor. So, you know, that will cause some hassles to you. So whether or not you get into trouble just kind of depends on where you are and the officer that you happen to come into contact with. And, you know, if we're concerned about things like justice, this really doesn't seem very fair. Okay? And that's the problem you run into as this process is taking place, because you're having more officers saying, I don't care, I don't want to deal with it. But then you'll have other officers who are saying, well, it is against the law. Okay? And, you know, therefore, I should arrest people and do something about it. Okay? So what that means is it's become rather inconsistent. Okay? One of the areas where this is of real concern is racial disparities then. Okay, so for instance, what if it were the case that you got a white kid and the officer just says, no, you can't have that, takes it away from them. And if it's a black kid, they arrest them. Okay, they may not even, you ask them to say, no, I don't discriminate, but at some subconscious level, that kind of thing would go on. In fact, when we look at racial discrimination in the system, which of course now has become, you know, something that we're really looking at, a lot of the people who are looking at that say, well, it's not like our whole system is, you know, just blatantly discriminatory, but rather it's a lot of times a series of little decisions that ends up that black offenders end up with worse outcomes than do whites. And it's just little things along the way that result in that. And, but, you know, it's not like the Southern sheriff saying, you know, I accuse you and therefore you're guilty. Those days don't exist too much anymore, but rather much more subtle kinds of things. And that could be one of them. You know, if a young black male is more likely to get arrested for marijuana than a white male, well, then you got a record. Okay? You know, that white male gets in trouble again. You look and say, well, he doesn't have a record. so it could be subtle kinds of things like that. And so there are those people who want to say, who argue that marijuana should be legalized because that would eliminate that particular problem, is that there'd be a more level playing field, at least with respect to that issues. Okay, so those are some of the things that law enforcement has to consider. There are some things that are going to need to be addressed. I mean, obviously this is happening. I mean, I think it's just a matter of time before most states will have legalized it. We don't know much about the effects on children and teenagers. And whenever we have drugs, we worry about what the effects are on developing brains as opposed to adults whose brains, for better or for worse, have developed. And so, one of the things we have to think about is, deterring the use of marijuana among minors, as we do with alcohol and other drugs, not always successfully, shall we say, but it certainly is a concern. And the fact, as I said, that, that there are long-term effects of marijuana, they're not understood, and that we should be doing research on this. Other things that people have raised, for instance, has been, what about impairment in the workplace? Okay, and how are employers going to handle this? Getting policies and procedures into place, which I suppose could just follow those for alcohol. That shouldn't be too much of a problem. How do we handle DUI? Okay, traces remain in your system after you're no longer high. Now, there's work on, they call it a polylizer, which would use saliva to estimate the amount of impairment in a person. And that probably needs further research. I mean, we do want to control, obviously with any drug, we want to control people using it with respect to driving. We would prefer that people would not drive under the influence of marijuana or any other drug for that matter. So, you're going to have procedures for handling this too, okay? And for determining impairment and so forth. Just as we do for alcohol, we actually have a pretty good set of standards for doing that. Okay, so those are some of the issue, and we got to think about them, anticipate them. So at any rate, those are some of the things that, have arisen, and I don't know if they're, I guess it's about time for questions, if there are any questions. Yes, no?
Carol, it's Maddie.
Yeah.
I might have a question.
Okay.
Just to get the conversation going, you said with legalization of marijuana, the recreational use is being increased because of self-reporting. Who's going to self-report recreational use?
Oh, gosh, people do it all the time. What you have to do is, you run a study and you're a professor and you say your answers are going to be either anonymous or confidential.
Oh.
That nobody knows that you gave that answer, or confidential, you won't reveal it. And in fact, what I've done sometimes is I'll just tell people, look, if your answers are confidential, I can't reveal them. If I did, I'd get fired.
Oh, very good. Okay.
Case, because if you promise confidentiality, that's it. Now, people choose not to believe that, but people are surprisingly forthcoming about, when you ask them about what criminal activities have you participated in and this and that, a lot of people will just flat out tell you, assuming that they think that nobody's going to rat them out or whatever.
That's true. Okay, thank you. That was good.
Yeah.
Carol, I have a comment and I have a question. The comment is on the gateway portion of this. We had a speaker a few years ago and talking about legalizing marijuana. And he made the comment that the gateway is more of the drug dealer than it is the drug itself, because the drug dealer can make a better profit off of cocaine and other types of drugs, meth, whatever the case is. So that was the point that he made. But the question I have is on the states are have a windfall, financial windfall with legalizing marijuana, but the federal government is not getting any of that money, or are they getting?
I don't know. Not that I'm aware of, but I don't know.
Okay.
Go ahead, Andy.
When I go to the doctor, they want to know if I've been using if I smoke marijuana, if I drink alcohol, if I use cigarettes. How do doctors feel about the use of marijuana? Are they generally in favor, opposed, don't care? What do you
I
think?
haven't seen any studies on that. I'm sure there are, but I haven't, that would be an easy enough study to do. You just do a quick survey. If you can get their attention. Doctors are hard to survey because they're so busy, and they'll put you off if they can, frankly, just because they're busy. I don't know.
Morton?
Yes. Have you heard any updates on when the dispensaries are going to be opening in Missouri? I know a friend of mine, his wife, the organization company that she's affiliated with, have the rights in St. Charles. They're going to open one down on Harvester, but with COVID, I know that's all gotten pushed back.
Right.
So have you heard of any dates when they're going to start
No,
opening?
and, I think because of the virus, everything is up in the air.
Yeah.
Everything is suspended.
I just saw something on the news last night that several dispensaries or outlets were going to be opening in St. Louis City or St. Louis County, like on Monday, but they didn't.
When we open up again, basically.
I guess they didn't give details. If it was medical, I guess it's medical, but where they
Well,
went.
you have to be medical. Yeah.
Yeah, I saw that on TV too.
Okay.
It's St. Louis,
Yeah. Okay.
only St. Louis.
Well, then St. Charles shouldn't be too far behind.
Yeah, they're supposed to be opening them in St. Charles and Troy, and then all of this COVID came along and all that stopped. But they were supposed to open up in the spring, and then that got pushed back, and now this is the first one I've heard that's opening is in St. Louis, and I saw that on TV.
Go ahead, Lee.
I was kind of interested in some of the ramifications of this still being illegal federally. Like when it first became recreational in Colorado, I remember NPR did a study. They hired some scientists to do a quality study on the products that were available, and a huge number of them were infected with E. coli and, all kinds of undesirable things because there was no regulation, because
Right.
it's not, still. And then I've heard a story about banking, that for folks who own these dispensaries, like they have to haul the cash to I don't know, there's a whole rigmarole in how they function because of that. And I just wondered if you'd talk a little bit about that, Carol.
Well, as I said, the security surrounding these places, I think they anticipated that, that there's going to be a lot of money, and that you've got a desirable quantity, desirable drug that people might want to have. And actually, it hasn't been as much, the security part hasn't been as much as a problem as they anticipated, because people did think about that. And it's amazing, I guess, if it's going to hit your pocketbook, people start thinking pretty hard about how you're going to protect it. But my understanding is that most of these places have really good security. And I mean, we have the technology for that. I mean, you can get a degree now in security, college degree in security. I mean, there's a lot out there. So you hire people, and you get technology.
I know of a company that cropped up specifically around this, and it's
I wouldn't be surprised.
former military, and because they're helicopter pilots, they know how to use firearms, and they have a business where they affiliate with growers, and if an alarm is set, they're on site within 45 minutes of the I don't know what the deal is, but it's a whole business around this, and again, I'm going to credit.
Hey, there's money to be made.
Absolutely, and what a great idea, right? And there's a lot of conversation in the credit union movement about how to bank the growers and and I know that there's a credit union that's built, that's their common bond. The common, because you have to have a common bond to be a credit union. The common bond is you're in the marijuana business.
Oh.
So it's working out.
Go ahead, Angie.
The states are opening up all these opportunities to have white drug dealers make a lot of money. What are they doing about all of the people that have been locked up and lost their lives that are still in prison for having
that's really a can of worms. One of the things, and I think this was in the last federal bill where they're going to make on schedule marijuana taken off the Schedule 1, was that, and this has popped up in other bills too, that your record be expunged for marijuana convictions. That's been proposed a number of times. And yeah, it does seem right. Yeah, and if you're in prison, well, I think usually though you don't go to prison. Well, if it's a large quantity though, yeah, it'd be a felony. I mean, we're not just talking about, you know, having some for your own use. That's a misdemeanor. But if you have a large quantity, yeah, you could be in prison. And if I were a prisoner, I would petition to get out. You know, yeah, that's an interesting point. But I know they talked about expunging records.
I just want to add that I believe the daily purchase amount you can buy in Colorado and many other states is the legal limit of misdemeanor to felony in around the country. Yeah, so it's actually not very much that can get you a felony charge for possession. And I think that, you know, we've probably all educated ourselves on criminalizing Black men for selling marijuana, and it's actually a very small amount. But anyway.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, it seems to have hit Black males harder.
Yeah.
They're more likely to get prosecuted.
Oh.
Go ahead, Greg.
Hi. I had just one comment. There's a site, an organization called the Last Prisoner Project. I think that's right. But if you look on Google that topic, and that's an organization working to get the people out of prison for nonviolent drug crimes like marijuana. So that's something to, if anyone's interested, could check that out.
I mean, well, the number of people, you know, back, say in the 70s or so, and early 80s, when I first started looking at crime statistics and so forth, not many people were in prison for drug offenses. And then it just skyrocketed. And if you look at the Federal Bureau of Prisons, where a lot of drug offenders end up, Federal Bureau of Prisons since 1980s has just about tripled. And much of this has to do really with the change in policy concerning incarcerating people for drugs. It's not like we didn't have drugs in the 70s and 80s and that people, well, in the 70s and that people were selling them, but we started really pursuing it hard. And it's, you know, prison populations are crazy big. And that is a fair part of the reason is because of our policies concerning drugs. We're paying an awful lot to keep people locked up for what basically most of the time is a nonviolent offense.
Other questions or
I
comments?
know they've been, sorry, I've seen that they're releasing some folks in prison to help with the COVID spread. I'm hoping some of these folks are top of that list.
Yeah.
I guess the bottom line is to vote. Vote, 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 get out to vote.
Vote, vote.
True.
But be sure you read all the fine print, because I remember when the signature gathering was happening, there were a couple petitions around this and other topics that were, they try to give them clever names, and sometimes the name is like the opposite of really the effect of what would happen when passed. And
like right to work.
Yeah. And so I remember on Main Street, there were two different groups with people spread out trying to get signatures for for legalizing marijuana or not. I mean, you just have to really read all the, don't just believe the headline of the act.
Right.
I remember that.
Yeah. Be careful about petitions. I know sometimes I question people when they have a petition, what does this mean? What does this mean? I had one guy say, you could look it up on the internet. And I said, well, sign something that I have to go then and look it up on the internet.
Yeah, and sometimes they're paid signature gatherers, and so they don't really know anything else than maybe what's on that paper, if that.
Yeah.
I was really kind of given the business to a guy at the library one time about something about testing for teachers. It was not related to marijuana, but I'm just saying the petition was definitely something I was not for. And being a child and grandchild of teachers, I was really getting passionate with this person about the goal of the petition. And then I realized he was just someone being paid to do it, but I still wanted to try to make him aware of what he's getting paid to do or not do. And yeah.
Thank you for your work.
Any other questions or comments? Okay. I wanted to mention that next Sunday is going to be an LED, a living ethics discussion. I think the topic that begs itself to be talked about is probably what's going on with all the protests and racial issues that have resurfaced in the area. So think about that as the week goes on, and we'll look forward to meeting here again on the same couch next Sunday. And then the following Sunday, we're going to have a live speaker who is Bart Warden. He's the executive director of the American Ethical Union. He'll be speaking to us live. The topic will be shared soon. I think that's about it for announcements, unless I'm forgetting anything. I just wanted to close with this quote by, yes, Andy, go ahead. Unmute yourself, Andy.
The book club is meeting on the 24th.
Yeah.
So we're reading
A Morbid Taste.
A Morbid Taste for Bones, and I'm about 7/8 finished with it.
Okay. Yeah, that'll be in your newsletter too, everybody. I wanted to close with this quote by Carl Sagan. The illegality of cannabis is outrageous, an impediment to full utilization of a drug which helps produce the serenity and insight, sensitivity and fellowship so desperately needed in this increasingly mad and dangerous world. So with that, head over to the nearest dispensary in Illinois and enjoy the afternoon.